Through the billionaire Juan March, the British government bribed high-ranking military officers and other prominent figures of Franco's dictatorship. This was done to prevent Spain from joining World War II on the side of the Axis powers. The bribes weren't the main factor keeping Spain out of the war, something I already covered in another episode, which I recommend listening to if you haven't already. But they certainly played a role. Naturally, Francoist propagandists have tried to deny or omit this information, which tarnishes the image of the regime's politicians and military leaders, but the evidence in primary documents is indisputable. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in today's episode I will reveal how Operation BRIBES began, who benefited from it, how much money they pocketed, and in what events and moments we can clearly see the influence of those bribes. This episode is part of a series on the man who was once the richest in Spain, so if you are not interested in Juan March's wartime business dealings, you may skip the first two sections of this video using the timestamps. The war began in September 1939, when France and the UK abandoned their policy of appeasement and declared war on Hitler after the invasion of Poland. From the outset, the British knew that Spain would maintain a cooperative neutrality with the Axis, so they were pleased when, that very month, Juan March approached them with a proposal for collaboration. At the time, there were 60 German merchant ships docked in Spanish ports, which would become a financial burden for Germany in port fees. March wanted to reflag 10 of these ships to carry out voyages to Latin America. The Mallorcan capitalist smelled a lucrative opportunity and pitched the plan to Spanish ministers, who approved it quickly. He told the Germans and the Spanish government that on each voyage he would reserve a space in the cargo holds for goods either destined for or arriving from the Third Reich, helping them skirt the Allied trade blockade. Of course, he didn't mention this to the British. Instead, he told them he would reserve part of the cargo for the UK and France. He needed to collaborate with the British because they controlled the seas and he wanted favorable conditions for his import-export ventures. Alan Hilgarth, the naval attaché at the British Embassy in Spain and a key player in Operation BRIBES, arranged a meeting between March and the Foreign Office and British Naval Intelligence. March reminded them that he had served the British during World War I, that he controlled the oil supply from the Canary Islands and Spanish Morocco, and he offered to provide information on when German submarines docked at the Spanish ports. Many British officials didn't trust March's offer of cooperation, which was understandable since he was known as an opportunist who played both sides during World War I. British Naval Intelligence Director Admiral John Godfrey wrote this about March to Churchill, quote, "He is definitely a scoundrel of the deepest dye, but was one of the first Spaniards to try to convince Franco of the necessity for reopening trade with England, and from his commercial interests, his sympathies are believed to lie with the democracies at the present time." End quote. In a response dated September 26, 1939, Winston Churchill, then still First Lord of the Admiralty, wrote, quote, "The fact that during the last war, when Spain was neutral and somewhat pro-German, he made money by devious means, in no way affects his value to us at the present time or his reputation as a Spanish patriot. He risked everything for General Franco at the outset of the struggle against Bolshevism in Spain, and financed the rebel government to the extent of his whole private fortune. I have no doubt that he hates the Nazi regime as much as the Bolsheviks, both being equally inimical to capital. I have no doubt that Marx's interests and probably his sympathies are with us now." End quote. It's true that Marx saw Hitler as Europe's greatest threat due to his ambitions for domination, and the British were thrilled to gain an ally with vast financial resources and an intelligence network like Marx, especially at a time when they were receiving no help from the United States. The purchase of German ships ended up taking years to materialize due to disagreements with both the Germans and the British. And in the end, only 7 merchant ships were bought and transferred to a Spanish state-run entity. Still, this initial contact laid the foundation for the close collaboration that would become Operation BRIBES. March did in fact provide money and from companies to the British to buy Spanish and neutral country ships between 1941 and 1942 in order to keep Germany from rebuilding its fleet in the Mediterranean. He was compensated with gold from the Bank of England, which he could collect once the war ended. Additionally, during his meeting with the British, Mark disclosed his intention to export weapons to Yugoslavia worth 200 million pesetas. This led to the British later using Mark as a middleman to send trucks, artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and anti-tank weapons to Turkey as part of an effort to bring this country out of neutrality. In 1940, Mark also negotiated arms sales with the French government. They agreed to buy despite the high prices, but the fall of France likely halted the deal. Regardless, this shows that Mark was raking in profits from arms trafficking. Juan March continued doing business with both sides in the war, though he had much closer ties with the Allies this time around. He owned a majority stake in the oil distributor CAMSA and the Santa Cruz de Tenerife refinery. Germany tried to infiltrate the company by attempting to purchase 50% of its shares. The deal fell through due to mistrust of Mark and the risky nature of the plan. However, by mid-1940, they managed to get CEPSA to store and supply 4,100 tons of diesel fuel over 6 months in exchange for the same amount of gasoline. In March 1941, they repeated the arrangement for 13,500 tons of diesel. The Nazis used Mark to convert the gold looted from European central banks into US dollars via Portugal. With those dollars, they bought oil on the international market through intermediaries. Mark took a 10% commission from these multi-million-dollar deals, on top of being able to buy scarce goods at reasonable prices. Goods he later sold on the Spanish black market for huge profits. On his shipping routes to South America, Mark's agents carried funds to support pro-Nazi movements. But the same Mark who profited from distributing Nazi propaganda also ran a network to help Jews escape Nazi-occupied territories. This wasn't out of the goodness of his heart. He simply saw a business opportunity. He facilitated their transport to a neutral country and from there to somewhere in the Americas. It's not surprising that the Germans generally trusted Mark, given his crucial role in the nationalist victory and that his newspaper Informaciones had been a mouthpiece for Nazi propaganda in Spain during the Republic. We don't know the full extent of Mark's dealings with the Nazis during the war, due to the destruction or concealment of both German and Mark's records. But Mark certainly stabbed the Nazis in the back more than once. In addition to reporting on their submarine movements and how they resupplied in Spanish ports, he placed his men aboard German merchant ships operating in the Mediterranean and Atlantic, later passing the information to the British. Thanks to his valuable services to the British, Mark was repeatedly pulled out of trouble through diplomatic interventions. On one occasion, American patrols intercepted one of his ships after he had bought up the entire tobacco crop of the year from the Dominican Republic. On another, the FBI investigated a ship docked in New York that was carrying export-restricted materials out of concern they might end up in Axis hands. Only British diplomacy saved the vessel and kept Juan March of the US government's blacklist of trade law violators. Now it's time to talk about how Operation BRIBES began. In May 1940, Winston Churchill's government was formed, and in the midst of extreme uncertainty, while France was collapsing under German attack, nobody knew what Franco might do. Churchill decided to appoint a high-profile conservative politician, Sir Samuel Hoare, as British ambassador to Spain. Hoare had served as a minister in various departments, had supported the sham that was non-intervention during the Spanish Civil War, and had experience with intelligence work and managing bribes. Back in 1917, he had been responsible for financing the pro-war elements of the Italian Socialist Party. This included the newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia, then edited by none other than Benito Mussolini, who was gaining popularity and developing the fascist ideology. Many in the British administration, as well as politicians, journalists, and both monarchist and Republican opposition figures in Spain, failed to understand Hoare's policy of appeasement toward Franco between 1940 and 1942. But it makes sense if we consider that Hoare believed in the success of pressure tactics, including bribes, to keep Spain from joining World War II. Hoare inherited a poorly organized embassy with very little influence over the Spanish government, which was heavily under German sway. The British goal was to support elements within Spain that favored neutrality and to reduce the dominance of German and Italian influence. The last thing the UK needed at that critical moment, with France collapsing and German bombs falling on British soil, was for Spain to enter the war and for Britain to lose Gibraltar, cutting off supply lines from India through the Suez Canal. Hoare requested that Lord Halifax, the British Foreign Secretary, back him without delay on anything he asked for, especially money, and to help him bypass any bureaucratic obstacles posed by the British Treasury or the Foreign Office. After being briefed on the political situation in Spain and the status of the embassy by naval attaché Alan Hilgarth, on June 4, 1940, Hoare sent Halifax a top-secret telegram stating, quote, "There are signs that the possibility of abandoning neutrality is gaining ground. I believe the time has come to act immediately to stop this momentum. A very well-positioned minister has reliable means of decisively influencing the political course to ensure Spanish neutrality. For this purpose, he may need up to £500,000, but swift action is essential." End quote. Soon, £500,000 wasn't enough. Hoare saw the need to increase both the amount of money and the number of people who needed to be bribed. To understand the scale of Operation Bribes in Spain, it's worth noting that in July and August 1940, the British gave only £20,000 to free France under de Gaulle. The primary goal of bribes was to influence the maintenance of Spanish neutrality. In the early months, the British would have been content with just delaying Spain's entry into the war by a few months. Prime Minister Winston Churchill approved the plan, knowing that every tool at his disposal had to be used to improve Britain's chances of victory. The British were aware of internal divisions within Franco's regime and hoped to exacerbate those rifts, making Franco hesitant to commit to war. To the British, Francisco Franco was untrustworthy. They saw him as a weak leader who was easily influenced by his brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano Suñer, and as a dictator forced to juggle competing interests between the military and the fascist party Falange. This was not an operation against Franco's dictatorship. In fact, the entire British foreign policy toward Spain during World War II, including Operation Bribes, was geared toward helping the Franco regime survive, even though they hoped to marginalize Falange. They kept the anti-Franco position in a dormant state, ready to be activated only if Spain joined the Axis. That strategy also stemmed from ideological motives, the strong anti-communist and anti-leftist sentiment of Britain's conservatives. Operation Bribes was meant to support the Alphonsine and Carlist monarchists, as well as most of the military, who opposed entering the war. The message had to be anti-foreign. In other words, not just anti-German and anti-Italian, but also anti-British. The idea was to frame any foreign interference in Spain as a threat. Pro-British propaganda wouldn't have worked. Hatred toward the UK was widespread among both the revolutionary and Republican left, who felt betrayed, and the victors who hated liberal democracies and blamed Britain for Spain's lack of imperial glory. We don't know for certain who came up with the plan to bribe Spanish generals and other leaders of the Franco regime to ensure neutrality. It could have been Alan Hilgarth, who took credit for it, but historian Ángel Viñas leans toward giving the credit to Juan March. Hilgarth couldn't admit to his superiors that a Spaniard, whom he later did business with, had designed this multi-million-pound operation. The Mallorcan Juan March was Spain's most experienced and effective corrupter, and he had a vested interest in Spanish neutrality to prevent further destruction and preserve the foreign trade that had made him so rich. Without Juan March, it would have been impossible for a newly arrived ambassador to launch an operation as far-reaching as Bribes within a month, one that extended into the highest levels of the dictatorship. And speaking of money, remember that you can support this show by joining my Patreon community or through donations. Links are in the description. And if you are new here and want to hear more untold stories from Spanish history, I encourage you to subscribe. Juan March, who had first-hand knowledge of the inner circle of power of the newly established Francoist dictatorship, was likely the one who informed the British about which military officers and regime politicians he planned to approach and consider susceptible to bribery. In general, the individuals who were bribed were military officers who supported the restoration of the monarchy and viewed Franco's dictatorship as a transitional regime. Even if they believed in an Axis victory, they were already inclined toward neutrality, and they saw the bribes as gifts to support a position they already held, only now with much more vigor. Those who received bribes were expected to influence Franco and others to prevent Spain from falling into the arms of Hitler and Mussolini. This could be done informally or more formally, through reports written with a particular bias or by presenting news in a specific way. Additionally, they were to influence key military appointments. The higher-ranking individuals who received bribes believed the money came from Marc and a group of Spanish financiers who wanted to avoid the horrors and destruction of another war in Spain. It's likely that these military officers didn't feel their honor was compromised, as they believed they were serving their country. One of the few British officials who was well informed about the ultra-secret operation wrote a preliminary memorandum detailing that the operation should be backed by $10 million distributed across several accounts belonging to the Mallorcan banker and his proxies. $2 million had already been mobilized, $3 million were urgently needed by the end of June 1940, and $5 million more will be transferred in December if the bribes yielded the desired results. A quarter of the funds will be paid in pesetas. The report revealed the names of 5 individuals to whom Juan March will directly hand over the bribes. General Quindelan, who will receive $500,000, although more funds will follow over the next 2 years. Generals Aranda and Varela, each slated to receive $2 million. Valentin Galarza, the Undersecretary of the Presidency and a key anti-Falangist monarchist involved in planning the July 18th coup, who will receive $1 million. And perhaps the most surprising name of all, the dictator's older brother, Nicolás Franco, who was to receive $2 million. Marc had to place Nicolás Franco on the board of directors of the Transmediterranean Shipping Company and as director of Unión Naval de Levante, a shipbuilding firm, to win over someone close to the dictator. The dictator's brother also sat on the boards of other major companies and was involved in all kinds of financial schemes. So, knowing more about his shady business dealings, it's not so surprising that he was a recipient of British bribes. At the second level, the 5 figures I've mentioned distributed bribes among military officers, though the recipients didn't know the money came from Marc or that it was British. Some individuals listed in the preliminary report as targets ultimately didn't receive bribes, such as Queipo de Llano or Agustín Muñoz Grandes, the former due to a loss of power, and the latter because the intelligence suggesting he wasn't pro-German was wrong. Second-tier figures included generals Luis Orgaz and José Solchaga. There was also a third level of bribed individuals, regular military officers who, under orders from their superiors, wrote reports advising against entering the war. As the months passed and the bribes proved effective, the British increased the funds and expanded the circle of beneficiaries. Despite the British documents declassified in 2013, there are still many gaps in our understanding of how Operation Bribes was carried out in practice, how Juan March interacted with certain generals, what actions were taken, the full list of bribe recipients, and exactly how much each received. By September 1941, the high-ranking officers most likely bribed included Luis Orgaz, High Commissioner of the Spanish Protectorate in Morocco, Valentin Galarza, Minister of the Interior, José Enrique Varela, Minister of the Army, Antonio Aranda, Captain General of the 3rd Military Region based in Valencia, Alfredo Quindelan, Captain General of the Balearic Islands and later of Catalonia, Miguel Ponte, Commanding General of the Army of Africa, and Lieutenant General José Solchaga. This raises the question of how Spanish oligarchs and foreign governments could buy off generals, ministers, and other top state officials. To understand this, one must understand that the Francoist dictatorship was a kleptocracy, a corrupt form of government where the private enrichment of a few families was paramount, at the expense of most people. You don't have to take my word for it. Even Juan March himself, in an April 1944 interview with the British Embassy's press attaché, denounced the corruption of Minister Demetrio Carceller, who amassed a massive fortune through black market dealings. March said the Francoist dictatorship was corrupt to its core, which is ironic coming from one of the biggest corruptors in the world. When Hilgarth presented Operation BRIBES before the British cabinet in April 1941, British politicians were shocked at the list of powerful figures they had in their pocket. Francisco Franco himself, whom some naive or outright foolish people still believe was not corrupt, had been involved in financial schemes and the unlawful appropriation of property since the start of the Civil War, all with complete impunity. There is evidence that Italy and Germany also bribed Spanish ministers, though no historian has thoroughly explored that topic to date. Some British bribe recipients are strongly suspected of playing both sides. One such case was Luis Orgaz, who obstructed government efforts to curb German espionage activities in Morocco after Spain reached an agreement with the Allies in May 1944. There are also signs that Carlos Martínez Campos, chief of the Army General Staff, collaborated with the British, and we know he received bribes from the Nazis equivalent to more than €500,000 in today's money. We also know that Nazi officials used Spaniards to safeguard their assets, in exchange, of course, for cuts given to military officers, businessmen, and aristocrats who acted as frontmen. The Francoist Spanish elites were thoroughly corrupt and thus easy targets for bribery by British, German, and Italian interests during World War II. Later, they were quick to curry favor with the new superpower, the United States. These were the same people who loudly declared their patriotic devotion to a stronger Spain free from foreign interference. Everything mentioned so far shows that this wasn't just a case of a few bad apples in the government and state institutions. Corruption was the norm and the modus operandi of the Franco dictatorship. In the 1940s, marked by hunger and misery in Spain, military officers, politicians, civil servants, and businessmen amassed fortunes through black market dealings, the exploitation of slave labor, no-bid contracts, and bribes from foreign governments. Juan March also knew that many generals were dissatisfied, and that many of them had no moral compass. I found varying estimates of what generals earned in 1942, but it wasn't much, especially with inflation spiraling out of control. It's true they received many services for free due to their status, but they believed they deserved a better life after killing so many Spaniards. According to the conversion established by historian Sánchez Isiaín, which calculates the real relative spending power rather than just inflation, one 1942 peseta equaled €8.70 in 2010, or about €11.92 in 2024. This means that the 4 million pesetas Quindelán received in bribes amounted to more than €47 million in 2024. But how were the bribes distributed? As I've mentioned, Juan March merely served as the channel for British funds to reach a small circle of figures close to Franco, who in turn distributed part of it to lower levels. March would regularly provide relatively small advances, usually in pesetas, but the bribed officials could only access the bulk of the promised sums after a certain date. According to the original plan, most of the millions were distributed by the end of 1940, but Operation BRIBES expanded until the end of 1943, with new funds aimed at reinforcing Spanish neutrality. Payments were made according to how the recipient behaved, specifically whether they had taken actions in favor of neutrality, and based on their level of influence. The British money was mainly deposited in the New York branch of the Swiss Bank Corporation, a subsidiary of the Société des Banques Suisses in Geneva, where Juan March held shares. The funds were held in US dollars, Portuguese escudos, and Swiss francs. The recipients likely kept their British bribe money abroad as savings or for investment, since Spain's strict capital control laws imposed harsh penalties. Juan March probably helped those he had corrupted in this regard, as he was highly experienced in concealing international wealth and laundering funds to bring them into Spain without arousing suspicion. Where can we see the influence of the bribes? As I've noted, many aspects of Operation BRIBES remain unknown, including the full scope of the actions carried out by the bribed individuals. However, from the very month the operation began, June 1940, when Franco and much of the military leadership wanted to join the Axis, Ambassador Hoare was already reporting positive results. Before a meeting between Franco and Hitler, Varela, Aranda, and Galarza, all recipients of British bribes, offered their advice on how to approach the Führer, and Franco listened. According to the British ambassador, this was a sign that the bribes were not being wasted. A major success of the secret British operation came when Colonel Valentin Galarza joined the government as Minister of the Interior in May 1941, joining General Varela, who was already serving as Minister of the Army. Galarza asked Alan Hilgard to ensure that the British press didn't make too much of the changes in the Spanish government. This is quite revealing, as it suggests that Galarza knew that the money came from the British, not from a group of businessmen and bankers led by Marc. Other bribe recipients from the monarchy scam were also promoted, with Luis Orgaz named High Commissioner of Morocco, and King de Land transferred from the Captaincy General of the Balearic Islands to that of Catalonia. The bribed official succeeded in influencing the removal of General Yahweh, who was suspected of being on the Nazi payroll. These changes were also convenient for Franco, who sought to appease the British, avoid further sanctions, and reduce the power of the hated Falange. At the time, many inside and outside Spain were wondering whether the country was being ruled by Franco or his brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano Suñer. Serrano Suñer had launched a Nazi propaganda campaign in the Falangist press, and there were rumors that he was conspiring with the Germans to replace Franco at the head of the dictatorship. Numerous generals, including Air Minister Juan Vigón, proposed to Ambassador Hoare that Serrano be assassinated for seriously jeopardizing Spanish neutrality. In July 1941, the Minister of Industry and Commerce, Demetrio Carceller, also told a British official that Serrano Suñer deserved to be eliminated. He was despised by nearly everyone, except Franco. The concern was how the Germans and Franco himself might react, given their family ties. On July 18, 1941, during the commemoration of the military uprising, Franco gave a fiery pro-Axis speech that deeply alarmed the Allies. Around the same time, Serrano organized a large Falangist demonstration in front of the British embassy, despite Franco's previous assurances that such events wouldn't happen. Galarza, infuriated, accused Franco of breaking his word and demanded the resignation of both Serrano Suñer and the Falange's Secretary General. A group of bribed generals, led by Luis Orgaz, warned Franco that he should not make statements on foreign policy without consulting them, and demanded the removal of the pro-Nazi Serrano Suñer from the foreign ministry. Here again, we can see the influence of British bribes. Some of these generals were in contact with civilian monarchies and even floated the idea of forming a provisional government opposed to Franco in the Canary Islands with British backing. A military plot with General Antonio Aranda as the most vocal figure requested weapons and diplomatic support from Britain and the United States to establish a pro-Allied government and dismantle Falange's influence. Juan Vigón may also have been bribed. He warned the German ambassador that the Spanish army would resist if the Nazis invaded Spain. He did this on behalf of several bribed military leaders who felt that Franco had not made Spain's stance clear enough. On September 3, 1942, Franco carried out a major cabinet reshuffle. The trigger was a Falangist bombing attack on the Carlists. Varela and Galarza reported the incident directly to the captains general and civil governors, bypassing the chain of command and making the incident public. This maneuver against the Falange, influenced by British bribes, backfired and led to the dismissal of these two bribed ministers. Aware of how unpopular his brother-in-law Serrano Suñer had become, Franco also removed him by blaming him for the bombing. With the cabinet reshuffle, Franco aimed to neutralize the most extreme elements of the Falange, who had also presided over catastrophic economic mismanagement that caused thousands of deaths, and reduce tensions between Falangists and monarchists. These changes were externally influenced by the fact that, by then, the threat of a German invasion had faded, and Spain was becoming increasingly dependent on trade with the Allies. After the Allied torch landings in North Africa, the course of the war changed. The dictator's brave brother, Nicolás Franco, worked to calm the pro-war and pro-Nazi fervor of Asensio Cabanillas, Barrón, and Yahweh. Asensio Cabanillas, then Minister of the Army, pledged to resist any internal or external pressure that might threaten Spain's neutrality, even by force. This included rejecting requests to move troops through Spanish territory, forbidding the use of ports and airfields, and preparing plans for military resistance in a worst-case scenario. Luis Orgaz in Morocco made a similar commitment. In doing so, Nicolas Franco fulfilled his obligations under the Operation BRIBES and secured his generous reward from Juan March. Ambassador Hoare noted that Nicolas's influence over his brother had grown significantly since Serrano Suñer's departure from the government, and that the caudillo's elder brother was now a moderating force. I don't want to delve too deeply into the chronological development of Operation BRIBES. For that, you can consult Ángel Viñes's book dedicated to the subject, which was recently translated into English. But it's worth knowing that one incident nearly blew the whole operation apart, and it had nothing to do with either the United Kingdom or Spain. The problem arose when the US government passed a law to freeze the bank accounts of individuals from neutral European countries. In September 1941, Hoare requested discreet diplomatic efforts to urgently unblock the funds for Operation BRIBES. Alan Hilgarth went directly to see Winston Churchill to make sure someone would speak with the US government to release the $10 million deposited in the Swiss Bank Corporation. The top-tier generals who had been bribed knew that the money Mark was giving them was held in New York accounts, so they must have become very nervous about a possible breach of such lucrative promises. In this critical moment, the banker Juan March transferred $5 million in Argentine mortgage bonds to save the situation. The British promised to compensate him later with gold from the British Treasury, which he could withdraw once the war ended. Eventually, the British informed the US Treasury Secretary in October 1941 about the secret bribery operation, but the accounts weren't unfrozen until December. Ahead of the Allied landings in North Africa, the British believed it appropriate to increase funding for Operation BRIBES to prevent Franco from becoming hostile along the Moroccan border. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden authorized a one-year extension of the operation on September 3, 1942. Although they believed it was highly unlikely Spain would enter the war given the way events were unfolding, they didn't want to take the risk. Juan March agreed that the bulk of the new bribes would be paid on December 31, 1943, based on whether its recipient had fulfilled their promises, and until then, he would continue handing out relatively small amounts in pesetas. The British were very satisfied with Marx's services and praised him for collaborating with them even during the darkest moments when their cause seemed lost. As of June 1954, Juan March still had the gold the British had given him deposited in London. The £2 million worth of gold from 1942 was now worth £2.9 million due to currency devaluation. March had made a very profitable deal. We don't know exactly how much money and indirect profit the Mallorcan capitalists earned for taking part in such a high stakes foreign operation, but it's safe to say it was a great deal. With that said, let's evaluate the scope and success of the British bribes. The corruption used to buy the loyalty of the political and military elite in Franco's dictatorship was one of the costliest British operations during World War II. Moreover, it was carried out at a time when the British were far from flush with foreign currency. Still, they correctly believed that keeping Spain out of the war was worth the cost. It was better to spend money than to spill British blood. What began as £500,000 in bribes eventually grew to £3.5 million or $14 million by mid-1941, and the program was extended again through the end of 1943 with an additional £3 million. In total, £6.5 million were spent. This was slightly more than what the British spent supporting the Gulf resistance movement between 1940 and 1941. In 1944 pesetas, using the free market exchange rate in Tangier, those £6.5 million amounted to at least 322.4 million pesetas, more than the combined budgets of Spain's Ministries of Justice and Interior, which oversaw Franco's repression. In today's euros, we are talking about an operation worth a minimum of around 450 million euros, possibly rising to 1.5 to 2 billion, depending on the method used for conversion. The wealth of some Spanish families today stems directly from these bribes. No Spaniard contributed more to keeping Spain neutral during World War II than Juan March Ordinas. The bribed officials certainly influenced Franco and sometimes imposed clear limits on the dictator. Given the direction of the war and Spain's economic and military situation, Most military leaders had positioned themselves against Spanish involvement in the war by late 1940. Franco couldn't launch such a dangerous adventure without at least some internal backing. Ultimately, the most decisive factor in whether Spain joined the war was how the war itself unfolded. Even Axis victory had seemed assured, and Hitler had accepted Spain's participation at a moment favorable to Spanish interests, no amount of British money would have been enough to keep Spain out, regardless of how bad the country's economy was. So, as I mentioned in the episode on why Spain didn't enter World War II, the bribes were just one factor. Important, but not the decisive one in ensuring Spanish neutrality. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and share it on social media to help spread the word. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you believe in the importance of high-quality historical content, consider supporting me at patreon.com/newhistoryspain, where you can get early access to all my content, exclusive merchandise, or a shout-out in an episode. In the next episode, I will wrap up the Juan March series by discussing his life under Franco's dictatorship, including his acts of opposition to the regime, the huge scandal and profits from the Barcelona traction case, the creation of the Juan March Foundation to whitewash his image, and his death. Thanks for listening, and see you soon!